My name is Mireille Auclair. I was 27 when I stopped flinching at my sister's voice. It happened on New Year's Eve, at the long oak table my grandmother had left us, the one with the water ring near the third chair that nobody ever tried to sand out. The candles were lit. The good plates were out. And my sister Delphine was mid-sentence, wine glass tilted at that careless angle she'd perfected since childhood, when she said it, casually, the way you'd mention the weather. Some of us actually built something this year. Mireille just survives. That's not the same as succeeding. The table went quiet in that particular way tables go quiet when everyone already suspects the truth, but doesn't want to be the one who says so. My mother's fork paused halfway to her mouth. My father studied the tablecloth like it owed him an explanation. I didn't answer right away. I want to be honest about that because for years I would have. For years I would have laughed it off, made myself smaller, found some joke to defuse the air, so everyone could go back to being comfortable. That had been my job in this family since I was maybe 9 years old, the pressure valve, the one who absorbed things so no one else had to feel them. But that year had been different. That year I had spent 11 months building something no one at that table knew about. I looked at my wine glass instead of her face. I thought about the letter still folded in my coat pocket, the one I'd read 4 times on the drive over, the one with the notary's seal at the bottom. I thought about my grandmother's voice, the last time I saw her, saying, "You don't owe anyone your whole truth before you're ready to give it." "Say something," Delphine said, when my silence had gone on a beat too long for her comfort. She needed the reaction. She'd always needed the reaction. It was how she measured whether her words had landed. "I heard you," I said quietly. She laughed, a short, satisfied sound. "That's it? No defense." "Not tonight," I said. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 6 months earlier, our grandmother's estate lawyer had called me, not her. That the old apartment building on Rue Vasseur, the one everyone assumed had been left to Delphine because she was the one who'd stayed close, who'd visited on Sundays, who'd performed devotions so beautifully for an audience, had actually been left to me, in trust, with a letter attached that I hadn't fully understood until I'd read it a dozen times. I hadn't told anyone, not because I wanted to hide it, because I hadn't yet understood what it meant, and I've learned that truths you don't yet understand are dangerous to hand to people who will use them before you do. I looked up from my glass. My sister was still smiling, waiting for her victory to be acknowledged. Minutes. I would think later, replaying it. It only took minutes for everything to change. But that night, sitting at that table, all I felt was a strange, still calm. The calm of someone who has just realized the ground beneath her is not what everyone assumed it was. To understand why that dinner mattered, you have to understand what came before it, the quiet architecture of a family built on one daughter's shine and another daughter's shadow. Delphine was born 18 months before me, and from the beginning she was the daughter who arrived first at everything, first steps, first words, first honors, first engagement ring. I don't say this with bitterness anymore, only with the clarity that comes from finally stepping outside a house long enough to see its shape from the street. Our parents weren't cruel people. They simply had a limited amount of attention, and Delphine had always known how to spend it before I got there. I became the observer. The one who noticed things, who our mother was calling which relative avoided which topic, when our father's silences meant tiredness, and when they meant disappointment. I turned that noticing into a career, eventually, analyzing risk for a mid-sized insurance firm, which Delphine found endlessly, quietly funny. Numbers instead of a life, she used to say, not unkindly, the way you tease someone about a hobby you didn't respect. Our grandmother, Odile, was the only one who ever seemed to see me clearly. She used to sit with me in her kitchen on Rue Vasseur while Delphine performed for whichever aunt had come to visit, and she would ask me real questions, not, "How's work?" but, "What are you afraid of lately?" She was the kind of woman who kept ledgers of small kindnesses, who remembered which grandchild had actually shown up during her hospital stays and which had sent flowers with someone else's card attached. She died in March, 11 months before that New Year's dinner. And for months after, I told myself her absence didn't change anything about how the family worked. I was wrong. The lawyer's call came in May. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone, hearing words like primary beneficiary and conditional trust, and not being able to make them line up with my sense of myself as the family's designated afterthought. I asked him twice to repeat it. Your grandmother was very specific, he said. She wanted you to have time. She said you'd know when you were ready to tell people, and that it wasn't anyone's business to know before you did. I didn't cry on that call. I cried 3 days later, alone, over something as small as finding one of her recipe cards in a drawer, her handwriting, faded ink, a note in the margin that just said for M, when she's older. I hadn't known that card existed. I hadn't known she'd been leaving things for me all along, quietly, the way she did everything. I spent that summer learning what the trust actually meant. Not just the building, but the small business tucked inside its ground floor, a stationery shop Odile had run for decades and that had, unbeknownst to any of us, been quietly profitable in a way none of us had ever asked about. I spent the summer learning to run it, badly at first, then less badly. I told no one at family gatherings. I let Delphine believe, all through that autumn, that I was still just surviving. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being underestimated on purpose, from watching people build a story about you and realizing it's easier, for now, to let them keep believing it. By October, I was spending 3 evenings a week at the shop, learning inventory systems Odile had kept in handwritten ledgers, correcting mistakes an accountant had been quietly making for years, discovering that my grandmother's small stationery shop supplied paper goods to 2 hotels and a university bookstore under contracts she'd negotiated herself in her 70s. I found myself laughing out loud once, alone in the back room, at the sheer scale of what she'd built without anyone noticing. Meanwhile, Delphine's year had been loud in the way some years are loud precisely because something underneath them is thin. She'd left her marketing job to start a consultancy, which she announced at every family dinner with increasing intensity, as though repetition might manufacture the clients that hadn't yet materialized. Our mother, ever generous with worry, had quietly given her money twice. I know this because our mother told me, eyes down, asking me not to mention it. I didn't mention it. I've never been the one who needed to announce things to feel they were real. There was a night in November when Delphine called me, not to ask how I was, but to vent about a client who'd canceled a contract. I listened for 40 minutes. Near the end, almost as an afterthought, she said, "At least I'm trying things. You've always just sort of existed in the background doing your little number's job." She didn't say it cruelly. She said it the way you'd note an obvious fact about the weather. I remember sitting with the phone against my ear, looking at the ledger open on my kitchen table, seeing my grandmother's careful handwriting tallying decades of quiet, unannounced success, and feeling something settle in me that wasn't anger. It was closer to clarity. I understood, in that moment, that my sister's whole self-image depended on a comparison she'd constructed years ago and never updated, a story where she was the one who tried and I was the one who watched. I didn't correct her. Not out of strategy exactly. I think I still wasn't ready. There's a difference between having the facts and having the strength to hold them up to someone's face. That difference closed sometime in December, quietly, without any single dramatic moment. I signed the final paperwork transferring the trust fully into my name on the 18th. I stood in the shop that evening after closing, running my hand along the counter Odile had stood behind for 40 years, and I thought, I don't need Delphine to know this to make it true. But I am done shrinking so she can feel tall. I didn't decide to tell anyone at the New Year's dinner. I want to be clear about that because what happened wasn't a plan. It was simply that I stopped being willing to disappear. The dinner began the way it always did. My mother fussing over the roast, my father pouring wine a little too generously, Delphine narrating her year like a highlight reel for an audience that hadn't asked for one. She talked about her consultancy in the present tense, though I happened to know, from our mother's worried aside in the kitchen earlier, that she'd lost her second largest client that week. She talked about building something real, her eyes flicking toward me once, twice, the way a performer checks whether the quiet person in the room is still watching. I was watching. I was also, quietly somewhere else, thinking about a conversation I'd had that morning with the shop's oldest employee, a woman named Solange who'd worked the counter for Odile since before I was born. She'd hugged me when I told her the transfer was final and said, "Your grandmother used to say you were the one who'd actually keep it going." She said Delphine would have sold it in a year. I hadn't planned to think of that at the table. But it was there, sitting behind my sternum, when Delphine turned to me with her wine glass and delivered her verdict on my life, like a woman reading a weather report. "Some of us actually built something this year. Mireille just survives. That's not the same as succeeding. I've already told you what I did." I said, "I heard you," and let the silence sit. What I haven't told you is what happened after. The part that made her regret it within minutes, though not in the way she might have feared, not through cruelty or a public unraveling. My mother, perhaps sensing the temperature in the room, asked gently, "Mireille, how are things at the shop?" Meaning the part-time bookkeeping I'd told them about back in July, the cover story I'd let stand because it was easier than explaining. And I realized sitting there that I no longer wanted the cover story. Not out of spite. Out of simple fatigue with making myself smaller. "Actually," I said, "there's something I should have told everyone months ago." Delphine's smile faltered, almost imperceptibly, the smile of someone who senses, before they understand why, that the ground has shifted. I told them slowly. Not to build suspense, though I understood later that it read that way. I told them slowly because the truth itself was still settling into me, even as I said it out loud for the first time. I told them about the lawyer's call in May, about the trust, about the building on Rue Vasseur and the shop inside it, and the 2 hotel contracts, and the ledgers in Odil's handwriting going back decades. I told them I'd spent the autumn learning to run it because I hadn't wanted to inherit something I didn't understand well enough to honor. My father set down his glass. My mother's hand went to her mouth, not in shock exactly, but in something closer to recognition, as though a shape she'd half-suspected for years had finally resolved into focus. Delphine didn't say anything for a long moment. When she did, her voice had lost its casual, weather report ease. "Grandma left it to you? The whole thing?" "The whole thing," I said. She wanted me to have time, before I told anyone. I think she knew I'd need it. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because it wasn't triumph, not really, or not only triumph.
It was something more complicated.
I felt the old habit rising in me, the instinct to soften what I'd just said, to reassure her, to manage her feelings the way I always had. And beneath that habit, for the first time, I felt something else. The recognition that I didn't have to. "You've been running Grandma's shop this whole time," Delphine said slowly, "and you didn't tell me." "I didn't tell anyone," I said. "It wasn't about you." That, I think, was the sentence that actually landed. Not the money, not the building, not even the fact of the inheritance itself, but the plain, unadorned fact that my entire year had not been organized around her attention. That I had built something enormous and quiet without once needing her to notice. She looked down at her wine glass, and for a moment I saw something I hadn't seen in her face in years. Not anger, but something closer to the beginning of shame. The rest of the dinner didn't dissolve into a scene. I want to say that clearly because I know how these stories are often expected to go. The shouting, the door slamming, the dramatic exit into the snow. None of that happened. What happened was quieter, and in some ways harder to sit with. My father asked careful, practical questions about the trust, the kind of questions that were really just his way of processing feeling through logistics. My mother reached over at one point and took my hand and said, "I'm sorry we never asked more about your year," which was its own kind of confession, though she may not have meant it that way. Delphine was mostly silent. Once, she excused herself to the kitchen, and I heard the tap running longer than it needed to, the sound of someone giving themselves a moment. When she came back, she didn't apologize, not that night, and I want to be honest that this used to matter more to me than it did in that moment. What she did instead was smaller, and in its own way, more real. She asked, quietly, almost like a different person than the one who'd spoken an hour before, "What was it like? Learning to run it?" I told her, briefly, about the ledgers, about Solange, about the 2 hotel contracts I'd nearly canceled out of fear before realizing they were the business's backbone. She listened. She didn't perform listening, the way she sometimes did, nodding too visibly, waiting for her turn. She actually listened. I don't want to suggest that one dinner undid 20 years of a particular shape between us. It didn't. But something had shifted, some old current had been interrupted, and interruptions, I've learned, are where change actually starts, not in the dramatic moment itself, but in the quiet recalibration that happens after. Later that night, walking to my car in the cold, I thought about Odil's recipe card, the one that said for M, when she's older. I understood, finally, what she'd meant. Not that I needed to be a certain age. That I needed to become someone who no longer needed the room's approval before I could speak plainly in it. The weeks after New Year's were quieter than I expected. Delphine didn't call to apologize in the tidy, cinematic way you might imagine. There was no single redemptive phone call, no grand gesture. Instead, there were smaller things. A text asking a genuine question about the shop's supplier contracts, an offer, tentative and a little awkward, to help proofread a grant application I was drafting for a small business program. I said yes to the proofreading. Not because I needed her help, I didn't particularly, but because I understood that this was her version of an apology, offered sideways, in the only language she'd ever really had, usefulness instead of words. My mother called more often that January, and our conversations had a different texture, less about managing Delphine's moods, more about actual things. She asked about Solange, about the hotel contracts, about whether I was sleeping enough given how much I'd taken on. It was strange to realize how much of my mother I hadn't known, simply because we'd never had room in our old routines for her to ask. I kept working at the shop most evenings. There's a particular kind of peace in physical, patient work, reorganizing a stockroom, updating a supplier ledger, replacing the ancient till Odile had refused to retire, that I hadn't expected to find so restorative. I understood, slowly, that this was what my grandmother had actually left me. Not just a building, but a version of purpose that didn't depend on anyone else clapping for it. Delphine's consultancy folded quietly in February. She didn't announce it at a dinner. She told me over coffee, plainly, without the old performance. I think I built it because I needed something to hold up against you, she said. Which isn't fair to either of us. I didn't tell her it was fine. I didn't need to manage her feelings about it. I just said, I know, and let that be enough. It's autumn again as I write this, nearly a year since that New Year's dinner, and I've stopped waiting for a moment that resolves everything neatly because I no longer believe those moments exist outside of stories. What exists instead is this. A shop on Rue Vasseur that turned a profit again this year. Solange teaching me things Odile never wrote down. A sister who calls sometimes, now just to ask how I'm doing, without an agenda folded inside the question. It isn't everything healed. Some old currents are still there, faint, under the surface. A flicker of the old comparison in her voice sometimes. A flicker of the old instinct in mine to shrink, so she can feel tall. But we notice it now, both of us, and noticing is its own kind of progress. I think often about the moment at that table, her wine glass tilted, her voice so certain of its verdict. Mireille just survives. I don't feel triumphant when I remember it anymore. I feel something quieter. Gratitude, strangely, for the silence I chose to sit in instead of the defense I could have offered. If I'd argued that night, I think we'd still be arguing the same argument, dressed in new words forever. Instead, I said almost nothing and let the truth I'd been carrying speak for itself. That was Odile's real inheritance, I think. Not the building, not the ledgers, not even the money. It was the permission to stop narrating my own worth to a room that had already decided not to see it, and to simply become, quietly, undeniably, someone who no longer needed them to. Some truths don't need to be shouted to change everything. They only need to be spoken once, plainly, by someone who has finally stopped waiting for permission.